Today's sermon is a little tricky. It's going to simultaneously date me, and it's going to leave half of you out because I'm talking about video games. Now, I know what you're thinking. For some of you who say, well, we've never played video games or they're not part of our life, that's fine. Trust me, I'll walk you through it. Because I'm planning on starting with the very first gaming system my family ever owned, the Atari 2600. I know it was... You really?
I played Atari.
Okay, this is good to know. Good to know the younger generation is with us. He's 17, folks. I'm still cool. Yes, the Atari 2600, it was black. It had a faux wood grain on the front. Ooh, it was swanky, y'all. It had these little toggle switches that were made of metal that if eventually they'd wear out, you'd have to shove some cardboard in there to hold it in place. And woe betide you if your brother's playing and all of a sudden you move your leg and it jolts it just a little bit and the thing turns off. Oh, Lord. There were some fights in the Lawson house about that. And you know what's funny is the games, they were so bad. Like, they were so ridiculous. You know, and it's funny because, you know, now I play, you know, video games on my current system, the Switch, and they're beautiful. You know, they've got voice acting and they've got marvelous, deep stories. And I mean, I've literally wept at moments in these games where friendship and the story just unfolds in such a marvelous way. But those early games, wow. You're a little, you know, they tell you in a booklet what you are and what's going on. And one of my favorites back in the day, my mom and brother's favorite was Berserk, where you fought little monstrous alien robots. But my favorite game was called Adventure. And in it you were supposedly a knight that had to slay dragons and return a sacred chalice to the Golden Castle. And of course, the chalice basically looked sort of like a mustache, and the knight was a little itty-bitty square that would move around, and the dragons, well, they look like really fearsome ducks, really. And one of the funny things about Adventure, though, was if you did get eaten by one of the dragons, your little character, your little cursor would be in the dragon's belly. That was kind of funny. But other than that, you were always trying to find your way, and you'd have to work your way through the maze to the Black Castle and find the, you know, and the higher the level that you played, the more castles there were, the more mazes, the more difficult it became. And then word suddenly came down. I don't even know how. How did they get news before the internet? How did they play video games before YouTube existed? I don't know. But apparently, word came down from Atari that inside the game of Adventure, there was a hidden Easter egg. Now, for those of you who don't know, an Easter egg is not an actual Easter egg. It's just something in the game that you find, or you do, or you complete, and it has nothing to do with the actual gameplay, but it'll give you some little reward. I'll give you an example from a modern game. There's a modern game that's based on Westerns, and if you take one of the characters and you lay them down on railroad tracks, you get a special reward called the Devious Award, right? Because just like those old black and white movies where they put the person on the railroad tracks, right? All you have to do is put them there. You don't have to leave them there. Just put them there, and then all of a sudden you've won this achievement, right? And it's just silly little things that you can do that happen in the game that have nothing to do with winning the game. It just has to do with you know, knowing that you found everything. Another good example, Zelda Breath of the Wild. There are these 900 things you have to find. They're called Korok seeds. You have to find if you find 900 of them. And you really only need around 400 of them. But if you find all 900, the game rewards you with a golden pile of excrement. And the reason is that the game writers were like, why would you find all 900? You have to, and so they just gave you this thing. It's ridiculous little stuff like that, right? Well, in the game of Adventure, they had the first ever Easter egg, the first ever hidden objective. And my brother and my dad found out that if you played level 3 of Adventure, somewhere hidden in the game was the magic dot. Doesn't it already sound lame? Like to listen to caller over there. Yeah, that really does. And it's one of those funny things, like at the time, you mean there's something hidden in the game? There's some sort of secret that we can uncover? And you know what my brother and dad did? They stayed up all night long for 3 days over a weekend trying to find the magic dot. They tried, and they tried, and they tried, and they never, ever found it. They never found it. Well, thanks to a new invention, kind of in the last 10 years, YouTube, my brother and my dad finally got to see what happened when you found the magic dot. It takes about 10 minutes. And so they watched, and wouldn't you know it, what happens with the magic dot is that you find the magic dot, you can walk through a wall, and on the other side it says, "Game created by Warren Robinette." That's it. My dad was so mad. He didn't talk to my brother, he just walked out of the room. And the very idea that something like this would happen, and he's like, well, now I've seen it, now what? And of course, the answer isn't very fulfilling. It's just kind of like, well, I guess that's over. After, who knows, 20 years, 30 years, they finally got their answer. They finally found the secret. Now I'm going to end this little story by just telling you, apparently at the time, Atari wasn't giving the game developers any credit for developing the games. And so Mr. Warren Robinette decided he would hide his name in the game so that he would get credit for it years later, and he eventually did. And so that's basically the end of that story. But don't you ever think that there are moments that we build something up, or something is built up, or something is already big, and we have to ask ourselves, well, now what? What do we do now? Today in the Jeremiah passage, the people of Israel have survived. Babylon has taken over their kingdom. They find themselves in exile all over the world. And the question comes, what do we do now? How do we live now? The temple is destroyed. We don't have synagogues to worship in. We don't have schools or libraries. Our nation is in shambles and has been destroyed. What do we do now? And it's at this moment that Jeremiah begins to speak to them. And he reminds them that even though things seem distant and difficult right now, even though they haven't seen all that they wish to see, even though they haven't experienced all they wish to experience, even though their lives are broken down, he has to give them this message. The Lord of the heavenly forces, the God of Israel, proclaims to all the exiles I have carried off from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and settle down. Cultivate gardens, eat what they produce, get married and have children. These then help your sons find wives and your daughters find husbands, in order that they too may have children. Increase in number so that you don't dwell away. As these people are in exile, they've lost their nation, they've lost absolutely everything. What does Jeremiah tell them to do? Go ahead and build a house. Go ahead and get married, build a garden, eat its produce. Pray for the city in which you find yourself. Wherever it is that you are, pray for its well-being. Find wives for your sons, husbands for your daughters, and endure. Can't even imagine how that would sound to them. Can't even imagine. Because sometimes when something bad happens, like these people have just experienced, the last thing you want to do is get right back to life. You sometimes wonder, when people get the news that, yeah, we've done the biopsy and it is cancer, how do they go back to work the next day? Or even in a couple hours, when someone finds out that they're actually dying, how do they do what they were supposed to be doing, what they were, quote unquote, supposed to be doing before? How do they return to work or to their lives? And the message, strangely, of Scripture is not to rage against the dying of the light, but instead to survive, to endure. And so many times in the gospel and in the life of the church, so many times that is the message. Simply survive, endure, keep going. There's a moment in the church's history, right after, what happened is that Rome was sacked, Rome was destroyed. And now they had all this Roman technology that no one knew how to fix, and the empire was falling apart all over the world. And there was only one institution that was big enough and had enough people to kind of pull the world back together, and that was the church. And at the time, the Pope, and this is long before the church ever split, at the time the Pope was a man by the name of Gregory, who we call now Gregory the Great. And what he said to the people, what he told the people is, he said, I know that we are suffering, but let me give you a series of stories that might help you and bolster your faith. And so what he did was he came up with what are called the dialogues. And he found several different stories of several different Christian people, and he told those stories as a means of bolstering the people's faith. He told the story of St. Benedict and St. Scholastica and St. John Chrysostom. He wrote all these down and he distributed them throughout the known world. And he said, look, these people endured despite difficult circumstances, and so too must you. You have to survive. You have to make your life better as best you can. You have to live the best life you can, no matter what your circumstances. And strangely enough, at this point in history, the other thing he started to do was he started to write church music. He said he was a fantastic musician, and of course now we know his music is Gregorian chant, right? And he wrote marvelous pieces of music that were so deep and so moving that they helped the people to stand against the difficult times they had ahead. And by the way, the times we actually ended up calling the Dark Ages, because they were dark, tremendously dark. No one was able to get an education. Medicine fell by the wayside and fell back into folk medicine and superstition. People, this is the period when we started having those horrible bubonic plagues. It was a difficult, difficult time. And sometimes I think, when we talk about the church in America, and when we talk about the church in the Western world, and sometimes we think, oh, how we're persecuted because, people at Walmart will wish us a Merry Christmas. And I sit there and I think, if we look at the history of the church, your persecution isn't much, is it? If we look at the history of the church and the stuff that people have to go through in their everyday lives, has anyone noticed that those St. Jude commercials just keep getting sadder and sadder? Think about those people. What do they do when they find out that their child is going to die, or that their child has a terminal illness? Think that there's a few now what moments for them? They still have to get up every morning. They still have to survive the struggle, right? And so many times the Christian message is just to get through it. As Sir Winston Churchill said, and I'm sorry this could play an expletive, but he says, when you're going through hell, keep going. And this is a very true statement, isn't it? Do you think that it was perhaps difficult for the children of Israel to make their way through the wilderness? Do you think that sometimes in that hot sun in that particular area, do you think that perhaps area of the world, do you think that there wasn't a few moments where they're like, gosh, this is awful miserable? This promised land seems awfully far. And yet the reaction of the church should always be to endure. But the reality is, the part of the passage that doesn't show up there, but it comes right after this. He says, pray for the city in which you've been placed. Jeremiah tells the people to pray. And here I think we have a key to endurance. That concept of turning to God and saying, help me get through this. Or, this isn't fair. Or, this is really tough, God. Or, I don't like this. That ability to speak to God, the heart and the concern of where you are in life, that ability to pray or to pray for others who can no longer pray, this is the root and the heart of endurance. Brother Chuck Killian, he's a poet, and he has a wonderful book of poetry. And one of his poems, actually the title of his first book of poetry, was called, and I love this title, Swift Lord, You Are Not. Now that's years of experience, isn't it? And the poem that he wrote called Swift Lord, You Are Not says this: Swift Lord, you are not. It has never been my experience that you fly quickly. And this reality that we have as we look at God and as we realize that endurance is a big part of the Christian faith, well, it kind of stands in definite opposition to our notions of God, right? I mean, so many people treat prayer as if it's some kind of vending machine. The prayer goes up and God dispenses the blessings, right? But the reality of the church and the story of the church, and this is why church history is so important, is because it shows us that sometimes endurance is actually what has to happen. Sometimes mere survival is all we have to hope for. To imagine how desperate your situation must be, where mere survival is what you're aiming for. And yet this is the story of these people. Isn't it strange that as Jesus goes to the cross, he meets the women and he says, don't cry for me. Cry for yourselves. One day, not a stone will lay upon another. One day you'll flee to the mountains and beg the mountains to fall on you. Jesus, in his final moments, recognizes the fact that difficulty and struggle are a cornerstone, a pillar of life. And that is where prayer becomes so important. John Wesley said, and I disagree with John Wesley here, Paul Bishop. John Wesley said that for some reason he thinks that prayer causes God to move. That when we pray, it causes God to do things. I don't think we cause God to do anything, to be honest with you. I think God does as God does. But I think what he really needed was the Quaker vision of prayer. And the Quakers said, prayer is